All right. Ezra Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Bava Metzia Daf Nun. It'll be the final daf before the Yontif. And it's just one topic, the daf, although you have to hold cheshbon a little bit. The Mishnah says like this. The Pasuk says that you're not allowed to rip anybody off. And the Pasuk says that up until a sixth, yeah, I'll say that a sixth, which is basically one divided by six, which is 16.6%. Once that goes over, so then let's say you rip somebody off by 20%. Sometimes the seller overcharged or the buyer overpaid. So then if it's over that shtus, that sixth, then the transaction is null and void. Okay, the transaction is null and void. If it's smaller than a sixth, let's say the mispricing was a tenth, so then it's mechila. We assume that the buyer is okay getting less, or the seller is okay for overpaying a little bit, so that's fine. But if it's exactly a sixth, so then we're going to learn that that the mekach is kayim. The transaction is 100%, and what happens is you have to return the overcharge, or he has to return the underpaid. That's all you have to know. Ha'ina, the mitzvah of not ripping anybody off is abba kesef me'esrim ba'abba kesef l'sela. If there are 24 kesef, there are 24 coins for $1, and the overcharge is 4, so the overcharge is 1/6 of the price. Shtus lemekach, the sixth of the price, that is a oina of the Torah. So what's the din? The Mishnah doesn't tell you the din, but I'm telling you the din. The din is that the transaction, there's no backsies on the transaction. However, that's not according to everybody, but there's no we'll learn that there is no backsies. But whoever overpaid or underpaid has to either return the money or now pay up the money. Okay, that's called oina. That's a sixth. Until when? So the Mishnah says, when are you allowed to collect the oina? Let's say the buyer overpaid for the item. He overpaid for the item exactly a sixth. Till when can he go back to the seller and say, give me back the overpayment? If he had time to take the item that he purchased home, to show it to a dealer or show it to his relative to ask, did I pay the right price? And if he had time enough to go home and then determine if he got ripped off and come back and complain to the seller, then he gets his money back. But he can't come back 2 weeks later and say, oh, you ripped me off. So there's a limited, let's say, a few hour period from the time that he purchased the item till the time that if he has a complaint about overpayment, he can come back and get the money back. Other than that, if he takes 2 weeks later, then we assume that he forgave the overcharge. So that paskin, that was the halacha of the Mishnah regarding a sixth. Rab Tarfin challenged, and he paskin belud in the city of Lud, which was a place that they did a lot of business. He said the rip-off of the Torah is shmoine kesef me'esrim v'abba kesef l'sela. So he said it's the third shlish lamekach. So the overcharge or the underpayment charge is 8 coins out of a 24, which is a third, 8 out of 24. So v'samchi tagri lug, the merchants of Lug were very happy. Why? Because if it's, let's assume if it's under a third, so then it's right away. We'll learn a question about that, but it's possible that the transaction is valid and you don't have to return the overcharge. If it's exactly an eighth, so that's more than a sixth. So then, yes, there's a chance the guy is going to ask for his money back, but it's still more than a sixth. So Rab Tarfon seemed to have gone lenient on the sellers for the merchants of Lud. But he said to them, Rab Tarfon said to them, Kol hayoim mutalachsar, that not that you have a full 3-hour window where the purchaser can come back and demand his overpayment back, but rather he has a full day to come back and get the money back. He has a full day. Amru loy, so therefore Rab Tarfon was lenient in one direction, but he's more stricter than the Chum in the other direction. The Chumim said that you only have 3 hours, and the buyer doesn't come back within 3 hours, then the seller doesn't have to give back the money. Rab Tarfon said there's a window of a whole entire day. Amru loy, so they said to Rab Tarfon, the Targray Lud said, "Oh, we don't like your psak. Yaniach Rab Tarfon, let's leave Rab Tarfon in our place." The Chachamim, and they went back to paskening like the Chachamim. Okay, so they first were happy about Rab Tarfon, and then they were not so happy. It's what we learned. Now, here is a very interesting question. The question is, we know that the answer is a sixth, but is it the sixth of the price, or is it a sixth of the value of the item? So listen to this. It could be even the value of the item. It's what we learn. Rav amashtus mekach shaninu. Rav says the determining factor is the value of the item. We determine what the real cost of the item is. If you pay a sixth more or a sixth less, then the transaction needs to, the overcharge or the underpayment has to be returned. Shmuel says shtus mois name shaninu. Not only is it the value of the item, but also the price you pay. So to understand clearly what's going on, you have to look at the examples that the Gemara is going to give. Shave shita b'chamsha. Let's say the item is worth 6 zuz, and you paid only 5. So really, so therefore, the seller got underpaid, right? The seller got underpaid because it's worth 6, and the buyer only paid 5. So he ripped him off by 1/6 of what the item is worth. Or the other way, in the purchaser, shavishite, it's worth 6, b'shiva, but the buyer paid 7, so he paid 1/6 more than what he should be paid. So that is based on the value of the item. You're paying a 6 more or 6 less. That's called, in the Torah. Everybody agrees. Rav and Shmuel don't have an argument about that. Ki pligi, when is precisely the argument between Rav and Shmuel? Shavi chamshu b'shita, v'shavi shiva b'shita. What it is, the argument is by if it's 5, it's worth 5, and what happened? The buyer paid shita 6, so he paid 1/5 more. So basically, if you look at the value of the item, he's paying 1/5 more, because 1/5 more than what he should be paying. So he's paying 20% more. So according to Rav, that would be paying, that's beyond Ainah. So therefore, according to Rav, that would be totally bittul hamekach. That means the transaction's null and void. But according to Shmuel, it's at the end of the day, if you look at the price you're paying 1 zuz more than what you should be paying. So you're paying an extra zuz, which total is a 6th more. So that would be considered Ainah according to Shmuel. Or Vishavi Shiva Bishita, or in another case, something that's worth 7, right? And you're paying only 6. So according to this way, you're paying 1/7 less than what it's really worth. It's worth 7, and you're only paying 6, so you're paying 1/7 less, which is not Ainah according. But if you look at the price that you're paying, you're paying 1/6 less than you should be paying, because you're paying 1 more of 6 less than 7. So according to Shmuel, both of these scenarios, you look at the price, the money. So you look at is it on the money? If you focus in on the money, are you paying a 6? Is it a 6th or not? EDV, I know how. In both cases, it is I know. According to Rav, that you look at the price that the value of the item, once something is worth 5 and you pay 6, so automatically you're paying more than you're paying beyond Ainah, so therefore the transaction is null and void. Shavi Shiva Beshita, but in the other scenario, when something is worth 7 and you're only paying 6 coins, and it's worth 7, so it's basically you're paying 1/7 less than what you should be paying. Then it's forgiven. The transaction is a forgiven transaction, and the transaction is fine. So that would be the difference between Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel said you could even focus in on the money. Shmuel, ki amrina bittel michilo bittel mekach. Then what's in this case, according to Shmuel, beyond lower than a 6 that it's forgiven, or on what's a case bittel mekach that you overcharge by more than a 6. So heike the lake is shtus mishnei stadim. There's no 6 on either side, on the items side or the money side. If it's a 6 on one side, if it's exactly a 6, then that's called Aino Hava. That is called Aino in the Chumash, and therefore the Mekach is Kayim. The transaction is valid, but you have to return the overcharge or the undercharge. Okay. Now the Gemara is going to bring a couple of rayas to Shmuel. I'm going to skip down because it's a very hard daf to do in one day, but I'm going to bring down what a clear raysa that agrees to Shmuel. 3 lines from the bottom. Tanya kavasi to Shmuel. We learned the braysa that corroborates from Shmuel. Mi shehutel olav yodei al yoina. Mi shehutel olav. Whoever got ripped off, he has the right of way. He's in the right. Ketzad. And then Brisa gives you an example. Which is exactly what we're discussing. If you sold something that's worth 5, the seller sold something that's worth 5, bivav, and he charged 6 coins, and it's really only worth 5. So the guy paid 1/5 more than what it's worth. But in coins, it's actually 1/6. He paid an extra coin. So Misan Sana, Lekeach, who got ripped off? The Lekeach got ripped off. Yad Lekeach al Elyoino. The purchaser he's in charge over here, and he can determine the outcome of what needs to be done over here. Ratza, if he wants, Oimelei ten Nima Isai. He can say, I want my money back, and therefore the transaction is null and void. Or you could say, Tenli Masha Nisani, or I want the transaction, but just give me back my overcharge that you overcharged me. Again, so this brisa right away in the beginning corroborates Shmuel's opinion that if it's a 6, even if when you look at the item itself, it's more than a 6, but if it's a 6 regarding the money payment, then you consider it Aina, and therefore the transaction could be valid. The transaction could be valid, but the overcharge has to be returned. That is the opinion of Shmuel. And the brisa continues. So right over here in the beginning of the brisa is a raya to Shmuel. Mochaloi, we go to Amud Aleph. Mochaloi shava sheish b'chamesh, mishin it's ana, moichar, yad moichar ala yoina. If you, in the other scenario, if something is worth 6, and he only paid 5, so who got ripped off over here? Moichar, the seller. He's selling something that's worth 6, and he only got 5 coins for it. So then, Yad Moicha al Halyona, the seller has the right to determine the outcome of what needs of this deal. Ratza, if the seller wants, Oimerlo, you can say, Tenli Mikri, give me back what I sold to you. Or you can say, Oy Tenli Masha Nisani, or give me more money than what you paid. You only paid 5, give me 1 more. So again, that ends that sugya of Ainoah. That ends the sugya of how do you determine what Ainoah is. I know Ainoah is a 6th. A 6, but what determines the 6? Is it the item itself, the item that you're purchasing, and the item, the subject of the transaction, or do you determine the 6 also by the amount of money you paid? Sometimes the item itself, it looks like you're overpaying by more than a 6, but when you look at the money part, it's exactly a 6. And there is the machlekes between Rav and Shmuel. According to Shmuel, that's oinoah, and the transaction is still valid. According to Rav, in certain cases, the transaction is not valid in that case, or sometimes, if it's less than a 6, then the transaction is valid. Okay. Next Gemara. Ibaylahu. I have a question to ask you. Pachos mishtis. If it's less than 16, it's again a 6th is about 16.6%. If the ripoff, the overcharge, or the underpayment was less than a 16%, so we say, what happens to the deal? So, according to Rabbanan, the transaction, what is the halacha deal with this transaction. La'alter havya mechila is right away considered that the transaction is valid, and you don't have to return even that small overcharge or underpayment because people forgive it. People know that it's very hard to precisely price an item. So therefore, right away, it's considered forgiven and no one has any claims against each other. Or maybe we give the purchaser a certain, like a couple of hours where he can complain, at least get his money back. We give the purchaser the right to show to a dealer or his relative to determine if he overpaid for the item. So we give the purchaser that right. And therefore, he's not forgiving right away. If, let's say, an hour later he comes back and says, you overcharged me by 10%, he could demand his money back, right? So what's the din? The if you want to say that we always give a purchaser, the sale is not final only if an hour or two after the sale, because we want the purchaser to go home to determine if he's getting a good deal by showing it to a tagar or a kroivai or a relative to determine if he's getting a good deal. If that's the case, that means ma'ika, what would be the difference between bein shtus lepachas mishtus? What would be the difference between selling something for exactly a sixth and less than a sixth? Both, you always giving the purchaser a window of time to get his overpayment back. So if he overpaid by 16.6%, you give him 2 hours to come back to get his money back. And if he even overpaid by 10%, you're giving him time to come back to the seller and get his 10% overpayment back. So what's the difference? Answers the Gemara, there is a clear difference. Ika, there is a difference. The ilu shtus, if it's exactly 16%, 1/6, yodoy al hel yoina, the purchaser, once he determines that he was legitimately overcharged, so then he has the right to determine what to do with this transaction. What could he do? Ratza, if he wants choizer, he can say, I don't want the transactions null and void. Ratza, if he wants, he can say koina, I want to keep the transaction, or return to me what I overpaid you. The ilu pachas mishtus, but if it's less than a 6, let's say a 10% overcharge, the purchaser cannot invalidate the transaction. He can only just demand his overpayment. Kana umachse oino. So the transaction is valid, but he could demand payment, or the overcharge payment we return. But pachas mishtus, if it's less than a 6, less than 16.6%, there's no way to invalidate the transaction. The sale is final, but you could demand the overpayment back. So let's turn over here. So I'm going to go to Amar Beis just to get you to the bottom line over here. So the Gemara really doesn't come out with a bottom line over here. The Gemara doesn't determine that exactly. The Gemara wants to say first that maybe sometimes it would make sense to say that we give a window of time for to determine if you're being ripped off or not, and then the Gemara says no, maybe, but if you say la'alter have mechila, if you're going to say that right away, we don't give any window of time, the sale is final right away, even for a 10% overpayment, then the Mishnah is not going to make too much sense between the back and forth between Rab Tarfon. So I'm not going to go into that. But the Gemara leaves it as an unresolved question over here. But the Gemara is leaning towards that even with a 10% overcharge, we give the right to the purchaser to come back and get his money back. Now the Gemara asks another question. We're going to Amud Beis, and we're going in the middle of the Amud Beis. We're going to go to Ibayalahu. Now we go to the other direction. The other direction is what happens, you got ripped off by 30%, 40%. You overpaid by 40%. So we know that the transaction is null and void. But does that mean that we give the purchaser the right to come back 3 months later and say, oh, I was ripped off by 40%, and therefore the transaction is null and void? So there's a forever return policy, or even if you got ripped off by 40%, there's a limit. there's only a few hours you can come back and mevatel the metkach. That's the question. Very clear. Iboy lahu. The Gemara's question is like this: Bitel mekach l'Rabbanan. If you're going to invalidate a sale according to Rabbanan, which means that let's say you overpaid by 40%. You're a purchaser, you overpaid by 40%. So overpaid by 40%, Rabbanan said, Bitel amekach. The whole transaction is null and void. Does that mean l'oilam chayzer? Does that mean that the purchaser has always a forever return policy and can get his money back and the transaction is null and void? Or we only give him a window. It's not a forever return policy. He only has a few hours to find out that he was ripped off by 40% and then come back to the seller and say, you ripped me off by 40% and therefore the whole transaction is null and void. So the Gemara says, the Gemara doesn't finish that. The imtim sloimi, even if you want to say, that you only have a window of a 3 hour to get to go back and to the seller and have your complaints out with him because you overpaid by 40%, then what ma'ika bein shtus liyasel shtus? What would be the halachic difference between being ripped off by 16% than being ripped off by 40%? You always both have a certain couple of hours to complain to the seller. Other than that, beyond that, there's no returns. There's no backsies anymore. So what would be the difference between exactly Ainoah and more than Ainoah, beyond Ainoah? So the Gemara says, Ika, there's going to be a very big difference. The Ilu, if it was a shtus, Mishin is Ana Choizer. If it's exactly a shtus, exactly 16%, then the one that got ripped off, let's say the purchaser got ripped off, he can make null and void the whole entire transaction. The seller can't do it because he wasn't ripped off, okay? Or if in the opposite case, if the seller was ripped off and the purchaser, then the seller has a right to make the transaction null and void. The purchaser has no right. But be'ilu yesal shtus, if it was so beyond a 40% markup, right, or a 40% underpayment, so then even if the person who was the one that underpaid, or the one that overcharged, so the one that caused the whole mispricing, shneim chayzrin. It doesn't matter who got ripped off; both of them automatically make null and void the entire din. So let's get to the bottom line over here, and then we're gonna stop. One more thing. Amar Rava. Rava said, and Rava ends off the whole sugya over here. Hilchus halacha is pachas mishtus. If you got ripped off, less than a 6, so less than 10%, let's say you overpaid or got underpaid by 10%. Nikna mekach. Then the transaction is final. Yoisra al shtus. But if it's more than 16.6%, so if let's say it's 20%, 30%, then bittul mekach. Automatically, the transaction is null and void. Shtus, if it's exactly 1/6, 16.6%, kana, the transaction is valid, but you have to return the underpayment or the overpayment. It depends. If you're underpaid, you have to come up with more money, or if you're overpaid, you have to return that money. But zeh by both cases, where you say bitel, all cases, it's not forever. You only have a window to demand your underpayment or overcharge of a few hours. Other than that, once that goes beyond that, then it's nikna hamekach. Then the transaction becomes final. We don't give you a forever return policy, and that's what we say. Tanya kavasi de Rava. There's a brisa that corroborates Rava. The brisa says like this. I know pachas mishtus nikna mekach. If it's less than a 6, the mekach is valid. Yes, al shtus. If it's more than a 6, batal mekach. The transaction is invalid. Shtus, if it's exactly a 6, kana or machzayna, then the transaction is valid and you return the ayna divrei Reb Nosson. So Reb Nosson is basically the opinion of Rava. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Aimer, Rabbi Yehuda says yad moicher, if it's a shtus, then the transaction is not automatically valid. Yad the seller has, or whoever got ripped off, has the upper hand. because not that if it's a shtus, it's automatically valid, but roitza, we give the one that got ripped off a leniency. If he wants, he can just back out of the whole transaction. Roitza, he could say, give me my item that I sold you back because you underpaid me by 6. Or or you could give me but what you overpay, what you still owe me. But we do give him a chance that if you got ripped off and it's exactly a shtus, we give you a chance to be mevatel lemecha. Says the Gemara, conclusion, by both cases, we only give you a window of a few hours to be able to purchase, to be able to go home and to decide if he overpaid for the item, because he could ask an expert. But if he didn't come back during a period like 2-3 hours, then automatically the transaction is 100% valid. Okay, it's a hard sugya, but here we will stop. Okay.